The scream tore through the dawn like a blade through flesh, a single, piercing wail that silenced the gulls wheeling over the Seine. Old Gunter froze mid-cast, his fishing net sagging in his gnarled hands as he squinted downstream. The river stretched wide and gray before him, its surface rippling with the first breath of spring, but something darker stirred beneath the mist. Shapes emerged, faint at first, then sharp as a nightmare, dragon-headed prows slicing the water, their wooden jaws grinning with menace. Gunter's breath caught. He'd heard the tales, whispers of Northmen who drank blood and burned churches, but never thought they'd come this far. The shapes multiplied, dozens upon dozens, until the river seemed to bleed shadows. He dropped his net and ran, his boots slipping on wet stones, the scream behind him swallowed by a rising chant that chilled his bones. On the Isle de la Cite, the heart of Paris thrummed with a different rhythm. The island fortress rose from the Seine like a stubborn fist, its stone walls crowned with wooden palisades and ringed by the river's sluggish flow. Within, the royal palace buzzed with the clatter of goblets and the murmur of voices. Charles the Bald, king of the West Franks, slouched on his throne, a silver circlet glinting against his dark hair. At 22, he bore the weight of a crown he'd barely earned, his sharp eyes flicking between the nobles clustered around him. Easter loomed 2 weeks hence, and the court buzzed with plans, feasts, prayers, a grand mass to rival his brother's courts in the east. The air smelled of wax and incense, the promise of sanctity. "More wine," Charles snapped, waving a jeweled hand at a servant. His voice carried the petulance of youth, though his tone hardened as he turned to Count Odo, a grizzled man with a scar tracing his jaw. "You're certain the levies will be ready? I'll not have Lothair mocking me come summer." Odo bowed stiffly, his chainmail clinking. "The men are mustering, sire. But the river folk speak of raiders, Northmen, they say, burning steadings near Rouen." Charles snorted, draining his cup. "Peasants and their ghost stories. The Seine's too narrow for their ships, and my uncle's wars keep them busy in the north. Focus on the feast, Odo. I want venison, not rumors." Across the hall, Bishop Hincmar of Reims pursed his lips, his skeletal fingers clutching a crozier. The king's dismissal grated on him, but he held his tongue. He'd seen the omens himself, a raven perched on the cathedral spire, its black wings spread against a blood-red dawn. The monks whispered of divine wrath, of sins unpunished. Hincmar glanced at the stained-glass saints glowing in the morning light, their painted eyes seeming to plead. He muttered a prayer under his breath, the Latin soft as a sigh. Beyond the walls, the city stirred with the rhythms of early spring. Fishermen hauled nets along the riverbanks, their voices mingling with the creak of carts trundling over muddy paths. On the island, masons chipped at stone, repairing a tower battered by winter floods, while children darted through the shadow of the unfinished cathedral, its arches reaching skyward like skeletal ribs. The air carried the tang of fish and the faint sweetness of thawing earth. Paris was no grand capital yet, just a clutch of timbered houses and churches huddled around the king's stronghold. But it pulsed with life, a fragile jewel on the Seine's breast. In the monastery of Saint-Germain, Brother Anselm knelt before the altar, his tonsured head bowed over a psalter. The quill in his hand scratched ink onto vellum, copying verses to ward off the chill seeping through the stone floor. Around him, the brothers chanted, their voices weaving a tapestry of praise. Domini salva numbers. The Easter vigil would be their triumph, a beacon of faith amid the squabbles of kings. Anselm paused, his gaze drifting to the narrow window. The river glittered beyond, a silver thread under a sky bruised with clouds. Something flickered in the distance, a sail, perhaps, or a trick of the light. He frowned, then bent back to his work, the chant rising like a shield. Gunter stumbled into the village on the northern bank, his chest heaving as he pounded on the miller's door. "They're coming," he rasped, his voice cracking. "Ships, hundreds of them, dragon heads and all." The miller, a stout man with flour-dusted hands, peered out, his face paling as shouts echoed from downstream. A woman clutched her babe, her eyes wide, while a boy raced to ring the church bell. The clang cut through the morning, sharp and urgent, but it was too late. The first longship rounded the bend, its oars beating the water like a war drum. Warriors leaped ashore, their mail glinting, axes raised high. A thatched roof burst into flame, the crackle of fire drowning the bell's toll. Back on the island, Charles lounged through another report, taxes from Tours, a petty dispute over land, when the distant bell reached his ears. He straightened, frowning, as Odo's head snapped up. "What's that?" the king demanded, but before Odo could answer, a horn blared from the watchtower, low and mournful. A guard burst into the hall, his face slick with sweat. "Sire, ships on the river. Northmen, dozens of them." Charles rose, his goblet clattering to the floor, wine pooling like blood on the stone. Hincmar crossed himself, his crozier trembling, while Odo barked orders to the scrambling men. Outside, the cathedral bells joined the clamor, their peals rolling over the city like thunder. The king strode to the window, his breath fogging the glass. Beyond the palisades, the Seine churned, and there they were, ships upon ships, their prows snarling, their sails black against the dawn. Shadows stretched across the water, creeping closer with every stroke. In Saint-Germain, Anselm's quill slipped, ink splattering the page as the chant faltered. He stood, joining the brothers at the window, their faces ashen. The river was alive with monsters, wooden beasts bearing steel and fire. The monks' lips moved in silent prayer, but the words felt hollow. The shadows had come, and Paris trembled in their grasp. The oars bit the Seine with a rhythm like a war drum, steady and relentless, as the longships surged upstream. Mist clung to the water, curling around the dragon prows that grinned through the haze. Jaws carved with runes, eyes painted red as blood. At the helm of the lead vessel stood a giant of a man, his braided beard whipping in the wind, a bearskin cloak draped over shoulders broad as an ox yoke. His name was lost to the Franks, a whisper on the wind, but his presence roared. He gripped a shield emblazoned with a raven, its wings spread wide, and raised it high. Behind him, warriors roared, a guttural chant that rolled over the river like thunder. "Odin! Odin!" The sound was a blade, sharp and cold, cutting through the dawn. On the northern bank, the village of St. Cloud burned. Flames licked the sky, devouring thatch and timber as screams pierced the smoke. A farmer, his pitchfork trembling in calloused hands, faced a Viking twice his size. The Northman's axe flashed, a blur of steel, and the farmer crumpled, blood pooling on the muddy earth. His wife fled, clutching a wailing child, only to stumble as a spear found her back. The Vikings moved like wolves, swift, merciless, their boots pounding the ground, their laughter mingling with the crackle of fire. A church bell clanged weakly, then fell silent as a warrior's hammer shattered its frame. Gold candlesticks and silver crosses vanished into sacks, the plunder piling high. The giant at the helm watched the chaos unfold, his gray eyes narrowed. He barked an order in a tongue like breaking ice, and the ship split, half veering to the southern bank, half pressing toward Paris. The river churned beneath their keels, frothing white as oars doubled their pace. Ahead, the Isle de la Cite loomed, its walls a faint shadow through the mist. The Franks thought their river a shield, but to him it was a road, a vein to the city's heart. He grinned, teeth bared like a beast, and hefted his axe. The day was young, and the gods were hungry. In Paris, the bells screamed. From the cathedral on the Isle de la Cite, their peals clashed with the horns blaring from the watchtowers, a cacophony that shook the morning. Charles the Bald paced the palace hall, his face flushed, his silver circlet askew. "How many?" he snapped, rounding on Count Odo, who stood grim-faced by the window. "Dozens, sire," Odo replied, his voice tight. "Maybe 100 ships, more than we've ever seen. They're already at the banks." 100. Charles's laugh was brittle, edged with panic. "Impossible. The river's too shallow, the season too early." He stopped as a distant cry reached them, sharp and human, carried on the wind. His hand tightened on his sword hilt, unused and gleaming. "Muster the levies. Now." Odo nodded, barking orders to the guards, but his eyes betrayed doubt. The nobles scattered, some to armor, some to argue, while Bishop Hincmar lingered, his crozier tapping the stone floor. "This is God's judgment," he muttered, loud enough for Charles to hear. "The pagans come for our sins." "Then pray harder," Charles snarled, shoving past him to the balcony. Below, the city roiled. Men stumbled from homes, clutching spears and rusted blades, while women herded children toward the island's bridges. The Seine glittered, deceptively calm, until the first longship broke the horizon, a black silhouette against the dawn, its prow a gaping maw. Charles's breath hitched. More followed, a tide of wood and steel, their sails taut with menace. Across the river, the southern bank erupted. At Petit Pont, a cluster of fishermen's huts flared into torches as Vikings stormed ashore. A boy no older than 12 swung a stick at a raider, only to be swatted aside like a fly, his body tumbling into the shallows. The warrior, a wiry man with a scarred face, ripped a net from its pegs and tossed it to his ship, then turned his axe on a fleeing elder. Blood sprayed the reeds, staining the water red. The Vikings moved with purpose, stripping the settlement bare, grain sacks, iron tools, a silver ring torn from a woman's finger. Flames spread, leaping from roof to roof, the smoke a shroud over the river. On the island, Brother Anselm clutched his psalter, the monastery's stone walls trembling with the clamor outside. The chants had stopped, replaced by the thud of boots as monks barricaded the doors with benches and chests. Through the window, he saw the first ships glide past, too close, their oars brushing the current mere yards from the shore. A Viking stood at the prow, his helm horned, his shield painted with a coiled serpent. Anselm's fingers traced the vellum, smearing ink as he whispered, "Domini, salva numbers." The prayer felt thin, drowned by the war cries echoing across the water. Charles's levies gathered at the river's edge, a ragged line of farmers and minor knights, their shields trembling. Odo rode among them, his voice hoarse as he shouted orders. "Hold the bridges. Split the men north and south." The king had insisted on dividing the force, trusting the Seine to slow the enemy. But as the Vikings closed in, their ships fanning out like a net, the flaw gleamed clear. A horn sounded from the northern bank, and the first wave struck. Warriors leaping into the shallows, wading chest deep, their axes raised. Arrows flew from the ships, crude but swift, thudding into shields and flesh alike. A Frankish spearman fell, gurgling, as blood bloomed across his tunic. Dusk settled, heavy and cold, as the Vikings carved their path. Campfires flickered along both banks, their glow a ring of eyes watching Paris. The giant stood on his ship, now moored near the northern shore, surveying the city's silhouette. His men dragged plunder to the water's edge. Sacks of wheat, a screaming girl, a priest's severed hand still clutching a cross. He spat into the river, the gesture a promise, then turned his gaze to the island. The Franks cowered behind their walls, their bells tolling like a death knell. He raised his axe, and his warriors roared again, the sound a tide that crashed against the night. In the cathedral, the Easter vigil began, the monks' voices quavering as they lit candles against the dark. Shadows danced on the walls, but beyond the stained glass, the true darkness grew, fire and steel closing fast. Paris held its breath, and the river ran red. The first Viking arrow screamed over the Seine at dawn, a black streak against the gray sky, and buried itself in a Frankish shield with a crack like breaking bone. Wulfric, a wiry soldier barely 20, flinched as splinters stung his cheek. He crouched behind the wooden palisade on the Isle de la Cite's northern edge, his spear slick with sweat, the weight of his mail dragging at his shoulders. Around him, the levies huddled. Farmers turned warriors, their breaths fogging the chill air, while the river churned below, alive with longships. The Vikings had come, not as raiders but as a storm, and Paris buckled beneath them. The ships encircled the island like wolves ringing prey, their prows snarling through the mist. Oars flashed, driving the hulls tight against the current, while archers loosed a ragged volley. Arrows thudded into the palisade, some skittering off stone, others finding flesh. A man to Wulfric's left screamed, clutching a shaft in his thigh. "Hold the line!" Count Odo roared, his horse rearing as he paced the bank, sword drawn. But the line wavered, shields trembling as the Vikings leapt into the shallows, their boots splashing dark waves. Wulfric glimpsed their leader, a giant in a bearskin cloak, his axe catching the first light, directing the assault with a bellow that shook the air. Across the river, the northern bank blazed. Charles's divided army had faltered hours ago, the contingent there overrun in a tide of steel. Wulfric had seen it unfold from the island. Vikings swarming the shore, axes cleaving helmets, a knight's horse gutted mid-charge. Then the ropes, taut lines slung across the water, dangling 111 Frankish captives, hanged in a grotesque display. Their bodies swayed, limp and bloodied, a warning etched in flesh for the island's defenders. The sight had shattered the levy's nerve. Some dropped their weapons and fled, only to be cut down by Odo's guards. Wulfric's stomach churned, but he gripped his spear tighter, the wood biting his palm. Now the Vikings turned their fury on the island. A battering ram, crudely hewn from a felled oak, slammed the Grand Pont, the bridge shuddering as iron-rimmed shields locked around it. Wulfric sprinted to the span, joining a knot of spearmen, their thrusts wild against the Viking wall. Steel clashed, a deafening ring. His spear glanced off a shield, then snapped as an axe hacked through its shaft. He stumbled back, drawing a short blade, as a Northman lunged, eyes wild beneath a horned helm. Wulfric parried, the shock jarring his arm, and drove his knife into the man's throat. Blood sprayed, hot and coppery, as the Viking fell, gurgling, into the river. The bridge groaned, timbers splintering under the ram's relentless blows. Beyond, the city's edges burned. Huts on the banks swallowed by flames, their smoke choking the sky. Vikings waded chest-deep, scaling the island's low walls with hooks and ropes, their war cries a guttural tide. Odin! Thor! Wulfric hacked at a hand gripping the palisade, severing fingers, but another warrior vaulted over, axe swinging. He ducked, the blade whistling past his ear, and tackled the man, both crashing to the stone. They grappled, fists and steel, until Wulfric's dagger found the Viking's ribs. He staggered up, gasping, as more poured in. Charles watched from the palace rampart, his face pale beneath the circlet, his knuckles white on the stone. The cathedral bells tolled, a frantic pulse, but the sound drowned in the roar of battle. "Where are the reinforcements?" he shouted, turning on Odo, who'd ridden back blood-spattered and grim. "You said we'd hold them." "They're breaking us, sire," Odo rasped, wiping a cut on his brow. "The river's no barrier. They're too many." A crash echoed. The Grand Pont's gate buckled, Vikings spilling through like a flood. Charles's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the smoldering banks, the bodies bobbing in the Seine. "Fight them back," he ordered, voice cracking. "I'll not lose Paris to pagans." In the monastery of Saint-Germain, Brother Anselm pressed against the barricaded door, the oak trembling as axes bit into it. The monks clutched relics, silver caskets, a saint's brittle bone, praying in quavering Latin. Through the window, Anselm saw the city aflame. Churches gutted, their spires black silhouettes against the firelight. A Viking burst through, his mail clinking, a torch in one hand, an axe in the other. "Flee!" Anselm cried, shoving a novice toward the crypt, but the torch arced, igniting tapestries. Flames roared, swallowing the altar, as the Vikings' laughter rang out. Anselm stumbled back, coughing, the psalter slipping from his hands into the inferno. Wulfric fought on, his world shrinking to steel and blood. The Vikings breached the palisade, driving the levies back toward the cathedral square. He parried an axe, ducked a spear, his blade slashing a Viking's thigh. Red bloomed, the man fell, but another took his place. The air stank of smoke and sweat, the ground slick with gore. A horn blared, sharp and close. The giant strode through the chaos, his axe dripping, his raven shield raised. He pointed at the island's heart, the palace and cathedral, and his men surged, a wave of iron and fury. The Petit Pont fell next, its defenders hacked apart, bodies tumbling into the river. Vikings stormed the southern bank, torching homes, dragging screaming women by the hair. Gold chalices clattered into sacks, icons shattered under boots. Wulfric saw it all from the square, his chest heaving, his blade notched and heavy. Odo rallied the last knights, their horses snorting, but the Vikings met them head-on, spears piercing flanks, axes felling riders. Odo's horse screamed, collapsing, pinning him as a Northman loomed. Wulfric lunged, driving his blade into the Viking's back, but Odo lay still, blood pooling beneath him. Charles retreated to the palace, guards slamming the doors as the Vikings closed in. The cathedral glowed, its windows bursting in the heat, the monks' cries fading into the blaze. Wulfric stood alone in the square, the giant's shadow falling over him. The Northman's axe rose, a crescent of death, but a horn sounded sharp, insistent, from the Viking lines. The giant paused, turning to the river, where his ships rocked, laden with plunder. He spat, a curse in his jagged tongue, then bellowed an order. The Vikings faltered, their tide ebbing as they dragged loot and captives to the banks. Wulfric sank to his knees, his blade clattering on stone, the square a graveyard of broken shields and cooling blood. The giant glared across the river, then at the island's core, the palace, still standing, a taunt. His men retreated, fires crackling in their wake, but the promise lingered in his stance. They'd return. Paris smoldered, its edges ash, its heart exposed. The bells fell silent, and the storm held its breath. The Seine ran black with ash, its surface a mirror for the flames licking Paris's wounded banks. Wulfric staggered through the cathedral square, his blade notched and heavy, his mail caked with blood and soot. The Vikings had pulled back from the island's core, their war cries fading into a low growl, but the air still thrummed with menace. Smoke stung his eyes as he glanced at the palace, its walls scarred but standing, a fragile bastion against the chaos. A horn blared from the northern shore, sharp, commanding, and Wulfric's gut tightened. The pagans weren't done, they were waiting. Inside the palace, Charles the Bald paced, his boots scuffing the stone floor, his circlet askew. The hall reeked of fear. Sweat-soaked nobles, their voices a tangle of blame and desperation. "We can't hold them," a lord stammered, his hands trembling. "They've taken the bridges, the banks, everything." Charles rounded on him, eyes blazing, but his voice cracked. "Silence! I'll not lose my city to beasts." Beyond the walls, the cathedral smoldered, its spire a charred skeleton against the dusk. Bishop Hincmar knelt by a window, muttering prayers, his crozier abandoned on the floor. Count Odo limped in, supported by a guard, his leg bandaged but bleeding through. "Sire," he rasped, "they've stopped. Their leaders on the north bank, signaling. We've a chance to parley." Charles froze, his jaw working. Negotiation meant weakness. His father's ghost loomed in his mind, Charlemagne's iron legacy. But the alternative was annihilation. He nodded, sharp and reluctant. "Send someone. Offer terms. Gold, silver, whatever it takes." Wulfric watched from the square as a white banner rose over the Grand Pont, its tattered edges fluttering in the wind. Two emissaries, Odo's squire and a grim-faced priest, crossed the bridge, their steps faltering under Viking eyes. The northern camp sprawled along the riverbank, tents of hide, piles of plunder, captives bound and whimpering. The giant stood at its heart, his bearskin cloak rippling, his axe planted in the earth like a claim. His gray eyes tracked the Franks, cold as frost, as they approached. "Speak," he growled, his voice a rumble through a thick accent, the words barely Frankish. The squire straightened, his voice trembling but clear. "King Charles offers tribute, wealth to spare your blades. Name your price." The giant's lips curled, a predator's grin, and he spat into the mud. 7,000 pounds. Silver and gold. Bring it by dawn, or Paris burns to the waterline. The priest blanched, clutching his cross, but the squire nodded, retreating with the weight of defeat on his shoulders. Back on the island, the Vikings probed again, a sudden, vicious feint. Wulfric sprinted to the Petit Pont, where a dozen Northmen splashed ashore, torches flaring. He met them with a ragged line of survivors, their spears jabbing through the dusk. An axe swung, grazing his arm, and he roared, driving his blade into a Viking's chest. The man fell, blood bubbling, as Wulfric kicked him into the river. Another torch arced, igniting a cart, but he hacked at its bearer, severing an arm. The Vikings retreated, laughing, their point made. Time was bleeding out. Charles heard the clash from the palace, his fists clenched as the squire returned. 7,000 pounds, the boy reported, breathless. "They'll leave if we pay." The hall erupted, nobles shouting, Hincmar decrying pagan greed. But Charles silenced them with a raised hand. "Gather it," he ordered, his voice flat. "Church silver, my treasury, the Lord's coffers. Do it now." Hincmar protested. "The relics, the altars." But Charles cut him off. "Your God won't save us. Gold will." The night deepened, the city a tableau of ruin. Monks wept as guards pried chalices from altars, their hammers ringing on sacred metal. Nobles surrendered rings and chains, their curses bitter, while carts creaked under the weight of chests hauled from the palace vaults. Wulfric joined the effort, his arms aching as he dragged a sack of coins to the riverbank, the clink of silver a hollow sound against the crackle of distant fires. The Vikings watched from their ships, their silhouettes stark against the glow, axes resting but ready. By dawn, the tribute stood ready. 7,000 pounds of gleaming wealth, a mountain of ransom stacked on the Grand Pont's edge. Charles emerged, his cloak mud-stained, his face a mask of fury and shame. The giant crossed the river alone, his boots thudding on the bridge, his raven shield slung across his back. He towered over the Franks, inspecting the horde with a grunt, coins spilling from sacks, ingots glinting, a golden cross winking in the half-light. "Enough," he said, his voice a blade's edge, and waved a hand. His men swarmed forward, dragging the treasure to their ships, the Seine rippling under the load. Wulfric stood guard, his blade drawn as the Vikings worked. A Northman smirked, hefting a chalice, and Wulfric tensed, but Odo's hand on his shoulder held him back. "Let them take it," the Count muttered, his eyes hollow. The giant lingered last, his gaze locking with Charles's across the bridge. No words passed, but the air crackled, a king's humiliation, a warrior's triumph. Then he turned, striding to his ship, the bearskin swaying like a storm cloud. The longships groaned under their bounty, oars dipping as they pulled from the shore. Flames still flickered on the banks, but the Vikings' tide receded, their chants fading into the mist. Wulfric watched them go, his chest tight, the square silent but for the wind whistling through shattered stone. Charles stood motionless, his nobles averting their eyes, the weight of the ransom heavier than the gold they'd lost. In the cathedral's husk, Brother Anselm emerged from the crypt, his robes singed, his hands empty. The altar was gone, the relics ash, but he knelt anyway, whispering a prayer into the smoke. The river flowed on, carrying the Vikings' laughter downstream, a promise of return etched in the morning's quiet. Paris breathed, battered and bleeding, its survival bought with a price too steep to name. The Seine flowed quiet again, its dark waters swallowing the last echoes of Viking oars. Mist draped the river like a shroud, curling around the husks of longships fading downstream, their dragon prows swallowed by the haze. On the Isle de la Cite, Wulfric slumped against a cracked wall in the cathedral square, his blade resting limp across his knees. Blood crusted his hands, a dull ache pulsing through his slashed arm, but he barely felt it. The air smelled of charred wood and wet stone, the fires on the banks guttering out in smears of black smoke. Paris lay broken, its edges ash, its heart bruised but beating. The square stretched empty around him, a graveyard of splintered shields and trampled banners. A child's shoe lay abandoned near a toppled cart, its wheel still spinning faintly in the wind. Across the river, the northern bank smoldered. Huts reduced to cinders, the hanged captives cut down and left to rot in the mud. Wulfric's gaze drifted to the Grand Pont, where the last chest of tribute had vanished into Viking hands hours ago. 7,000 pounds of silver and gold, a king's ransom, and yet the silence felt heavier than the loot. In the palace, Charles the Bald stood alone on the rampart, his cloak stained with soot, his circlet clutched in a trembling fist. The nobles had retreated, their whispers of blame trailing behind them like shadows. He stared at the river, its surface glinting in the weak dawn, and saw nothing of triumph. Only the giant's parting sneer, etched in his mind like a brand. Footsteps approached, Count Odo limping, his face gray, but Charles waved him off without a word. The king turned back to his chambers, the door slamming shut, a hollow echo in the stillness. The cathedral loomed over the island, its spire a jagged ruin against the sky. Brother Anselm knelt in its gutted nave, his knees grinding into ash-dusted stone. The altar was gone, the stained glass shattered, shards glinting like fallen stars amid the wreckage. His psalter lay somewhere beneath the debris, its prayers burned away, but he whispered anyway. Domini miserere nobis. The words rasped from a throat raw with smoke, a fragile thread in the quiet. A breeze stirred the embers, carrying the faint tang of molten silver. The relics, melted and lost. He bowed his head, hands empty, as the first light pierced the broken roof. Beyond the walls, the city stirred faintly. A woman wailed, cradling a charred bundle, her home, her kin gone. A boy darted through the rubble, scavenging for scraps, his eyes hollow. The riverbanks bore the scars, blackened fields, toppled crosses, a fisherman's net tangled with a corpse bobbing in the shallows. The bells hung silent, their voices stolen by flame and axe. Wulfric watched it all, his chest tight, the weight of survival pressing harder than the battle itself. The Vikings were gone, their ships a memory on the horizon, but their laughter lingered, a low, mocking hum carried on the wind. Wulfric rose, wincing as his wounds protested, and sheathed his blade. He glanced at the palace, then the cathedral, then the river stretching west. The Franks had paid for peace, but it tasted of ash, brittle and fleeting. The giant's shadow loomed in his mind, a promise unspoken. They'd return, hungrier, bolder. Anselm stood, brushing soot from his robes, and stepped into the dawn. The Seine glittered, serene and cruel, its current washing away blood and gold alike. He crossed himself, a final act of defiance, and whispered one last prayer into the silence. Wulfric turned away, his boots crunching on broken stone, the city's wounds a mirror to his own. Paris endured, but the cost carved deep, and the river kept its secrets.